Here is our first flipped classroom on Hamilton's financial plan. We will also review many key terms that we've already covered in class. The benefit of a flipped classroom is that instead of taking notes in class and waiting for everybody to finish, people work at their own pace, taking notes. The purpose of this is that you can learn the material at your own pace. You can pause this at any time, rewind it, do whatever you need to so you can take the notes and understand the material and take as long as you really need. Now if you review, if you see first our timeline up here, if you look at the Salem witch trials, you would know and remember that there are economic, political, social issues that are going to push many people to convict others of being witches. But I think a really important factor is obviously the economic issue that we pointed out. Wealthy women, women that stood to inherit a lot of property are going to be the ones that are going to be mostly accused and possibly convicted. Many people also will remember the American Revolution, and today in class we're doing an activity to see how much you remember about the American Revolution. Hopefully we do not have to cover it as much. The French and Indian War in that time period is where you see that laws are passed that really start to anger the colonists from 1763 really until about 1775. That's when the actual fighting started, even though the colonies did not declare independence until 1776. George Washington is going to be our first president. And when he's our first president, he will choose Alexander Hamilton, who was almost like a son to him. He didn't have any children of his own. His wife had been married before and had children. So he is the first Secretary of the Treasury. And as everything really revolves around money, you're going to see that Hamilton's going to try to put the nation on a strong financial footing. We owed so many countries money. People were fighting amongst different states. My state is supreme, and he decides to go with a federal approach. He will be in direct conflict with the first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. So just to talk a little bit about George Washington's presidency, these dates are actually when he was elected, so he didn't, he served till the following year. He was a self-made man. He had really little formal education. If you've ever been to Mount Vernon, it is absolutely amazing. That's where his estate is, but he had a lot of money, and he was also like a land speculator. So when land would become available, he would quickly purchase it. During his presidency, though, he dealt with moderation and mediation because, like I said, his two cabinet members are going to be constantly fighting, and he will have to choose. So you can see the picture here of Alexander Hamilton on the left and Thomas Jefferson on the right, constantly going at each other, and he had to ultimately pick. And they had very different views. So this is Hamilton's financial plan, and his goal is to establish the public credit. So there's two different points. There's a total of 4. So we'll look at first what Hamilton thought and then what Jefferson thought. So during the Revolutionary War, the only way the soldiers really got paid was through war bonds, and they were paid by the government. And the problem is that many of these soldiers needed money now. So these land speculators would buy up these war bonds. They're called the current bondholders. Now, the soldiers that actually first received the bonds were called the original bondholders. And the problem is that they really sold, the soldiers sold their bonds for a lot less than what they were supposed to be. Nobody knew if the government would actually have money. So during the Revolutionary War, soldiers were paid with these bonds. Are they going to be worth anything? Speculators bought these bonds in hope that the government would pay the full value and they would have made a lot of money off of it. So speculators supposedly had insider trading information, which means this wasn't legal, but they heard about Congress's plan to pay off the war bonds. And another point is the federal government, they're going to pay foreign debts right away. Okay, foreign debts and state debts. So countries will have confidence in the United States, and then also debts can be paid, and as a country we could be, in the black, which means we don't owe a lot of money. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, didn't like this. He thought it wasn't fair to the soldiers and farmers that needed cash. He said, and he was right, there was possible insider trading information, meaning that speculators knew the bonds would be paid for in full. So then they went looking for these war bonds, knowing they could make money off of it. So Thomas Jefferson doesn't think, like Hamilton does, that the current bondholders should get the money. They think that the original bondholders, which were these soldiers and farmers, should get the money. Maybe they could split it, but he thought there's no way you can give the full value of the bond to the speculators or the current bondholders. Going on to the second one, Jefferson thought that the debt was in New England, which he was right, and all the southern states had paid off their debt. So you can already see a north-south issue. The north is pretty much supported by Alexander Hamilton. The south is supported by Thomas Jefferson. So things are not going to be, this is not going to be passing in Congress until a deal is going to be made because they're really upset about the debt. So compromise dinner, we're only on the first 2 points. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton met for a compromise dinner. An agreement was made to support, the points of Hamilton's plan in exchange for the nation's capital will be moved from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., which is definitely closer south. If you think the southernest state at this point is Georgia. Moving on to point 3 of Hamilton's financial plan, he's going to propose an excise tax on whiskey so the government can make money. The problem is that western farmers, like western Pennsylvania, western Virginia, they didn't have access to the Mississippi River because it was actually controlled by Spain. So they had distilled their corn into whiskey, so they had a lot of whiskey. So they were like, what the heck, why are you start putting a tax on our whiskey? And these are mainly farmers. So you see this issue again of rich versus poor, things like that. So Americans started to rebel. The rebellion is pretty much put down by Alexander Hamilton, George Washington. They had an army of like 10,000 people. Nobody really died, but Americans learned that they had to find other ways to address their grievances because the government, you're not going to rebel again. They just had done that, and every time there was a law that was passed that they didn't like, they rebelled. But now there's a new nation. This is after the Revolution, and if you think, you had to go through, the voting process, talk to your representatives, only white property-owning males could vote. In addition to that, he wanted a national bank and mint, so instead of people printing state money, which they did, which is just like state paper, and it had values in different states. It was really confusing. He wanted to have a national bank, and the government could actually print money, and it would be official tender. There would be government oversight. They could issue banknotes, make loans, and sell stock, and the stock actually sold out right away. So this is what Hamilton wanted to do. Let's see exactly what Jefferson wants to do. And if you go down to number 3 with Thomas Jefferson, you can see that he feels that the national government cannot force a tax on the states. So he was encouraging many states not to pay the tax, not support the whiskey tax, because remember, he's for the farmers. And also about the national bank, he says there's no mention of it in the Constitution. He's a strict constructionist, meaning if it's not in the Constitution, if it doesn't say it can be done, he did not want it. He said that it was unconstitutional. So you can also see, as we get to the Civil War and we move towards that time, there's already these issues for 50 plus years of the federal government can't have as much power, the states rule, and that isn't going to be decided until the Civil War. What does George say? Remember, George Washington is dealing with so much stress and so much fighting. Name calling in a newspaper, it was, anytime they would be in the same room, they'd be screaming at each other. He sides for Alexander Hamilton. This is going to force Thomas Jefferson to resign. But you see by George Washington doing this, you see the signing of the financial plan opens the doors for increased federal power.
Question. It's a tough one. Who shot Alexander Hamilton in that famous duel? All right, let's go to the phones and see who's out there. Hello, for $10,000. Who shot? Excuse me? I'm afraid your time is almost up. I'm sorry, maybe next time.
Okay, so make sure that you took notes on this flip classroom, and we will actually have a quiz today in class.